Hello and welcome to episode 138 of the Dive Down, the Magic the Gathering podcast focused on the latest decks, trends, and strategies for the casual spike. My name's Shane here in Denver, not Stan. But with me on the line are not my usual co-host. Stan's on paternity leave after the birth of his lovely son. Dave just moved into his new house. I thought I'd give them the week off. But since an episode with just me would be kind of boring, I called in some reinforcements. That's right, we have with us all three hosts of Mishra's Babble. They're here for a crossover episode, our first one in a long time. We had one a while ago with our Faithless Brewing family. And let me introduce these three fine gentlemen. First off on the line from Pennsylvania, it's Evan, perhaps better known as Everose.
Hello, hello.
Also with us from LA, it's Fran. Okay, Fran, a.k.a. Fapalzels.
I would like to say close in a North sarcastic fashion, but yeah, that's actually pretty close. And by that I mean as close as most people get it.
So why do you have this name so impossible to Google, my friend?
Because when I started streaming, I was doing it just for fun. It was a bad idea, terrible branding. But my last name is Pavlushek, and yeah, it was a bad idea. I should have changed a long time ago. Anyway.
All right. And then last with us, finally, from Albuquerque, New Mexico, we've got Gabe, also known as Spider Space. Welcome back to the pod, Gabe.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, good to be back.
More importantly, though, than just your individual personas and peoples, you are all part of a podcast called Mishra's Babble, right?
Yeah. We started it a little bit ago, so we're still kind of fresh, but we wanted to do like a little something where we kind of casually talk about what's going on in Modern and
casual 2-hour podcast.
2-hour podcast. Well, it's casual in the sense that we just don't prepare for it at all and just kind of go in. But
it sounds really well prepared though. So I mean, that's just what your experience and amount of playing in Modern, I think, brings to that. We'll definitely talk more about your streaming, who you all are, what your engagement with Magic is in a little bit. So on this week's ep, we're going to spend some time talking with you all about all sorts of interesting stuff. Your streams, your podcast, your approaches to improving and learning in Magic, how Horizons 2 has changed the way we have come to think about Modern. Also spend some time evaluating the metagame and the successful and not so successful decks of the Hunter Burton Memorial Open. I think it's going to be a fun one this week. But before all of that, we do have 2 weeks of housekeeping because we were off last week. So let's get cleaning. We've got 3 new patrons of the Dive Down Nation, some new citizens. We've got Nathan, Ryan J, and Darcy H. So thank you all for joining the nation. Cloudy and the other Mickey S went up in their tier. Mickey S, I don't know why he's back up for some reason. What a guy you are, the other Mickey S. We have 2 Mickey S's. That's a joke. And then we have 2 new reviews. We've got reviews from Chuck Buck and Gigagertz, so thank you for your feedback. We appreciate those reviews. If you want to join the Dive Down Nation, you want to become a citizen, head on over to patreon.com/thedivedown. The Discord is going super well. The transition over to Discord from Slack has been awesome. I'm really enjoying people being able to pop in and start streaming just right in Discord. I was streaming some Magic Online. I was streaming some Valorant, actually, with my fellow Denverite, Abe. That's been fun. So again, head on over, patreon.com/thedivedown. Also, Mana Traders. I don't know if you all are part of some competing streaming rental service, but we are Mana Traders, dyed-in-the-wool Mana Trader people. You can get 15% off your first 2 months. Use code THEDIVEDOWN2021 when you sign up. Okay, before we get back to the rest of the episode, I did want to spend some time with you three. Let our listeners get to know who you are, what your engagement with Magic is, how long you've been playing, what you're into, that kind of stuff. Spider's been on a bonus episode, but we know not everyone listens to those. So he gets to say some of that again. We drew straws, though, and Fran gets to go first, and he gets to tell us all about himself. Fran, what's your story?
All right. So my name is Fran, and my last name is unpronounceable. That's the gist of it, really. No. So I started playing Magic long time ago, I started with Odyssey, and that's when I was like 10 or 12 or something like that. And my very first deck was Psychedog. And it was a very, very bad Psychedog that I traded a friend of mine. We were both playing Pokemon, and I got bored of Pokemon because we were playing at a local LGS back when I was living in Argentina, where I'm from.
Were you making that Blastoise deck, that broken Blastoise?
No,
Gen 1 deck?
I had the Blastoise deck. I had like Turbo, the Haymaker. And I don't know if you remember that one, but it was like Hitmonchan and like Wigglytuff and stuff. And it was just unbeatable. Like, it was my friend and I, and we both had this deck, and we would go into the LGS, and we would literally week in and week out get like first and second. Like, we would always meet in the finals. And it just got boring to me. So he brings Magic.
I'm too good. I gotta stop playing this game.
It's way too easy. I had to find a new challenge. I started playing Magic. He gives me his Psychedog deck. Terrible deal. I give him all my Pokemon cards. He gave me this Psychedog deck that wasn't even complete. Awful deal. But I was hooked. And I started playing. I was playing at this LGS back in Argentina. The game is like not even, I don't even know what extended is. I don't know what standard is. Like, I have no idea about formats because we just played this, and I just go in every week and I play with the cards that I own. Then I started to get a little bit more serious. I built Blue-Green Madness, which I still have to this day. I showcase every now and then because pre-modern is my second favorite format after modern. I stopped playing in. I remember my last tournament that I went to was the pre-release for Guild Pact, and then I started playing for like 10 years, and I picked it back up in when I was in college, and I got super into like watching videos and stuff, and I remember watching the coverage for Pro Tour Born of the Gods, and in the backup match there is Matthias Hunt playing with this deck. And he's playing and he's tapping a bunch of mana and doing a bunch of things. He casts a Primeval Titan with 1 mana left, or like 2 mana left or something. His opponent mana leaks, and he exiles a Simian Spirit Guide to pay for mana leak. And I'm just like, what the hell is going on? He picks up his deck, he gets like a Totally West, and I'm like, what? Excuse me, what?
You can do these things?
Yeah, and that's kind of it. Like, from there, I was hooked. I started playing Modern. I bought all the cards for Splinter Twin, rest in peace. I bought all the cards for Pod, rest in peace. I bought all the cards from Amulet. They banned Summer Bloom, not rest in peace, but kind of. And yeah, that's kind of how it all happened for me. And I started streaming mostly for fun because. Yeah. I work during the weekends because I'm a musician, so I usually, play gigs. Not right now because, pandemic and whatever, but I used to play music during the weekends, playing the gigs. But during the week, I'm just like, I guess I'm just going to stream some MTGO. I'm just playing MTGO at home anyway. So I'm like, let's just stream it. And I started streaming. I started to get involved in the community. People are like, this guy who plays Amulet kind of maybe has an idea what he's talking about. And it kind of just,
that's all it takes is someone thinking you might have an idea of what you're talking about.
Yeah, that was kind of like the idea. And then I started just doing it regularly. I was streaming like every day of the week, and people started noticing. And then when the pandemic started, I'm just like, well, I'm not playing gigs anymore, so may as well just like devote all my time to streaming. And that's kind of what happened. So I've been doing it sort of full time since the pandemic started, kind of, and it's been fun. It's been a lot of fun, and I watch a lot of streams as well, and I've been wanting to do something with Evan for a while now. So I just got in touch with him, and I'm just like, yeah, what do you think if we started a podcast? And he's like, but I don't want to work, man. And I'm like, what if I told you we don't have to? Like, the whole concept of the podcast is just like a couple of friends just hanging out and just talking about Magic. Like, we just wanted an excuse to just like hang out and talk. And then we had technically Spider was a guest for the first episode, and we're like
special guest host.
Yeah, and we're just like, well, that went fine. So, do you want to join full time?
That was adequate. You did an adequate job, Gabe. Yeah. Thank you.
So yeah, that's kind of the story of how I got to where I'm at right now, at least.
Awesome. Evan, you're up next.
Sure. I got into the game around Invasion. Had 2 older cousins that played it. I didn't really play the game, but they gave me a really their bulk. So I collected the game around Invasion, but I didn't really start playing it until about 2012. So like RTR was just coming out, or I guess towards the end of RTR. When I ended up in college, I was going to school for game design. For a class, we had to learn how to play the game, and then I just got super into it.
That's what happens, right?
Yeah, it really got me. Before it was always just, hey, I like the art on these cards, but that got me really into it.
How'd you get into streaming?
Once I graduated, I had to kind of decide what I wanted to do with the game design deal. And I just found that was the aspect that I liked the most, was card games and all that kind of stuff. So I wanted to see if I could potentially make a living creating content for Magic. I got a part-time job at my LGS and kind of advertised that I was streaming content. Hey, you like Magic? Maybe you'd like to watch that. That's kind of how I got my like first viewer base. That got me out of the 0 to 5 viewers, and so that was like a little over 3 years ago, and just kind of been doing it ever since. Eventually, I started making enough that I could quit that LGS job and another job I had at the time. And
that's awesome. And Gabe, you get to repeat yourself. You've been here before, of course, but like, what's your story? How do you get involved in Magic and streaming and content creation?
Well, first I have to lord it over my 2, co-hosts from Mishra's Babble. Yeah, I was here first, guys. You may have not known I was going to actually be a host of Mishra's Babble, or Babble. I'm even messing up our own show here. But I was on the dive down first, so that's all I needed, right? As far as how I got into Magic, my older brother actually played the game before I did, and I'm sure, like, as a pretty young kid, he was like, hey, you want to like try to play this game? I imagine actually what was going on in his mind was like he was bored, and he was like, I'm going to give you whatever trash deck we have and like beat up on you playing that. And so I didn't know what was going on for a while. Just taking all those L's, and then eventually like emerged from the ashes. I feel kind of like Bane or something, of like like forged in the darkness kind of deal. And I really didn't take it too seriously for a while. I did a little bit of standard at like the local LGS. This would have been like Delver era standard with like Mirrodin Besieged, Innistrad standard, and let's see, I don't know, I played with some guys at the local university, and it was kind of a weird thing where it was just like bring whatever deck you want, and so you had people playing all sorts of jank, and then also
true kitchen table.
Yeah, I mean, it was true kitchen table, but you'd have people who were bringing like, oh, I don't know, here's just a random collection of stuff I had back in the day, and people who were like, here's my Enchantress Legacy deck. And so it was on full spectrum, and the guy who had Enchantress actually also had Death and Taxes, and I was like, man, like that's pretty cool, that time that you didn't let me do anything repeatedly. I really liked that.
Masochist.
And so when I got into Modern, it was like, man, how do I want to do this? And the interaction, the reason that I got into Taxes was I was like, okay, so there's no Caracas in Modern, but what if I used Manamo and Mangara? I almost forgot the name of the card. Mangara Manamo to try to exile multiple things. The idea being like, you tap it to exile something, untap it in response, exile another thing. Maybe you get to like Violent Flicker Wisp to save it. This was my dream. This is why I got into Taxes to begin with. So I played like Blue-White Taxes, and it was horrible. And you can find my like MTGO results way back in the day getting into it. We didn't have Modern locally, paper at the time. So I got into MTGO, which is where I really started to become competitive eventually. I know I just told you Mangara Manamo, and you're like, competitive? But eventually that's how it happened. And kind of like Fran, it was just sort of like, like I'm just playing anyway. So what if I just like streamed you guys? And it was mostly to the like Taxes community. They were largely like MTG Salvation based folks, who I now to this day argue with on Discord.
If you're not arguing about Magic, are you really playing it?
Probably not. But I don't know, man. I feel like it's a sham. I'm like talking about Thalia, and I haven't even registered a Taxes deck in a while. So
yeah, I'm actually really excited to talk to you guys in a little bit after our breakdown segment about what you're playing, how you're adapting to the new metagame, and things like that. So I'm glad that you all are here. I'm glad that you have your own pod on Mishra's Babble. I think it's awesome. I do listen to it. I've listened to every ep, and I think you guys are doing a really great job. So I'm glad to have you all on. Help our listeners be aware of you if they're not already. So they can find you on all the usual podcast outlets, right? Spotify, Apple Pods, any RSS space type thing.
We're looking to how to get into Apple Pods. I am the one dealing with all of the nonsense. I am not tech savvy
it is nonsense,
at all. I am not tech savvy at all. So I've been using like Anchor or whatever, and that like shoots us into a bunch of platforms. Not Apple Podcasts, which is the one that I personally use. So it's really frustrating.
I think you should probably take care of that, Fran.
Yeah, I've been meaning to for a while, but again, like the whole point about this podcast was to not make any effort whatsoever. So that would require me doing an effort. So I've been kind of pushing it because it's gonna happen. Just bear with us.
Hire an intern.
This is what we signed up for, okay?
Well, thanks again for being here. Thanks for all the introductions. And let's head on into the breakdown segment. We're going to be talking again about the Hunter Burton Memorial Open. We weren't on last week, and I'm actually kind of glad because we didn't really have a great full selection of data to look at about last Sunday or so, but we got all these deck lists to look at, and so now we were able to take a good look and look at the metagame, how things performed, and this was really kind of the first big paper tournament for Modern in 2.5 years? Something like that? I mean, it's a year and a half rather, not 2.5 years.
We had regionals in last February, and I remember those being the last actually, in-person tournaments that could have 200 plus people.
Exactly.
So it's been a minute.
So, right. These kind of tournaments are different than Magic Online tournaments because the metagame's different, the type of people that attend them are different. I think it's a little bit more on the casual spike end of things, which is great for us and our listeners to talk about. And this tournament took place on the 14th and 15th of August. Already sounds like a super long time ago, but I think, for all the reasons we just talked about, right? I think I want to spend some time looking at it. I already did spend a bunch of time looking at it, and I want to talk to you about what I found and the numbers that we've been kind of bouncing around in our Discord chat prior to firing this episode off. Before we get into the numbers, though, the Hunter Burton Memorial Open is a yearly event. It's held in memory of Hunter Burton, and the goal of the event is to increase awareness of suicide in the gaming community. The event's grown over the years, and I know a lot of people this year were looking forward to attending it. 526 players were listed. What's weird about the deck lists is that after the first 444 players, the deck list availability gets really inconsistent. So I'm not sure if players registered and didn't attend, or if deck list registration wasn't required, or they just didn't get in. But I don't know. But there's still a ton of data for us to look at here. And what I did is look at the top 300 decks, because this took a while. I didn't want to do all 444, okay? And normalized all the data so that the things were named appropriately. Every rogue deck was called Death and Taxes Twin or something like that. So I had to kind of look at what these rogue decks were, kind of see if Jund was actually Jund or whatever. And then I went to work with our old friend, Microsoft Excel. Microsoft, get at us. We want that sponsorship. So the top 300 meta. Okay, let's talk about this top 300 meta. Bear with me. I'm going to read some numbers to you all, and then we can actually talk about this. So the open field, more or less, day 1 or day maybe 1.5. Is it Murktide? 30 copies, 10%. Hammer Time, 25 copies, 8.3%. Decks that were unknown were about 5%. 4-color elementals at 5%. Cascade Rhinos, high 4s. Then we've got Tron and Jund, the two pillars of Modern, at 4%. Never will they ever be under 4% at any paper tournament ever. Red White Burn also at high 3s. So Boros, Burn, Jund, and Tron, every LGS ever will have these 3 decks. But then things starts getting a little bit weird. We have Bring to Light Valky at about 2.7%. Is It Prowess 2.3, Heliod Life Gain 2.3. We got Grixis Shadow, the dressed down version, 7 copies, about 2.3%. Also, Yawgmoth, same amount, 2.3%. Then, a bunch of stuff at about 2. We got Living End, Enchantress, Rakdos Monkey, and Grixis Luris, Eldrazi because it is a paper tournament, and Azorius Control at all about 2%, and then other 32%. So, y'all, here's our overall paper meta for our first pretty large paper tournament. What are you thinking about what people brought here, what they expected to win with, what maybe they didn't bring? Any surprises?
I mean, I definitely expected Murktide and Hammertide in Hammer Time to be the two most represented decks, and they super are. I thought Hammer Time was going to actually be a bit more than Murktide.
Me too.
Yeah, I am a big believer in this deck. I think it is super, super good. I think people still underestimate how good it is.
Hammer Time, you mean?
Hammer Time, yeah. So I think people underestimate Hammer Time, and that's probably why we're seeing Murktide being more represented. But those were 100% the two decks I thought were going to be up there. I thought Rhinos was going to be right there with them as well.
Yeah, I agree there too.
So a little surprised to see that one with some lower numbers, but
honestly, like the thing that surprised me the most is like that is the stuff that I expected to see, like the Murktide and the Hammer Time at the top of the whole thing. Elemental 16, I wonder how much of that is how expensive the deck really is in paper. Like we're talking about like $1,500. Like this deck is ridiculously expensive. So
and it's the kind of thing that not people don't have like 80% of it sitting around. Like
exactly.
They didn't have to like modify their Jund deck to like be the new one. It's like this is a whole new deck.
Yeah, exactly. And all of the new cards that this deck plays are expensive, and a bunch of them is just like sure, like Solitude is a great card, but I don't think there are any other. I'm gonna say good decks, despite they're gonna say Death and Taxes, but like any other decks that really will play for copies. Like it's not a card that you're just like super happy to. Yeah, I'm just gonna jam 4 copies of this card that's gonna 2-for-1 myself every time I want to kill anything. So because of that, it's like it just forces you into buying some cards that maybe you don't want. And also like Flamekin Harbinger, which is like the 1-drop that tutors. That card is $10, dude. $10 in paper. Like, how insane is that? Like, I would expect people to just like not be playing as much this deck, mostly because of the price tag, if I'm being honest. And the other thing that surprised me, I was expecting Heliod to be huge. I still think Heliod is nuts right now, and I still think that they is obviously very heavily underplayed because Magic Online, right? So. But I played against the Heliod deck at my LGS, like when I went for the first time in forever, like 2 weeks ago maybe, and I got paired against it, and my opponent goes like, well, turn 2, I'm going to play this Heliod, and turn 3, I'm going to, like Collected Company, here's a Spike Feeder, and I'm like, oh, that's right, I can't win anymore. That's it, like that's the game. It's like we don't have to sit here and I have to, like you have to click a million times and it's just like, sure, you're like gaining 500 life, but I can deal 500 damage, so it's fine. No. This is just like, I'm at like 5 billion life. Yeah, I'm not going to be able to deal that much damage. So like we're done here. So I'm surprised that more people did not bring that deck. Also because it's the kind of deck that oftentimes is quite popular. Like creature combo decks like Melirapod
sure.
we had in the past and like whatnot. Like those kind of decks usually, people like that kind of deck a lot. So I was surprised to not see more of that, particularly because it's kind of like the only deck in that vein that is viable right now. Sure, like the Yawgmoth deck, I guess, is also pretty similar, and that deck is also very, very good and very, very underplayed. But I guess that's a little bit different because I think that deck is actually pretty hard to play. So,
oh yeah.
And it's kind of like the same deal, like it's a new archetype almost, even though it's like 2 or 3 years ago that the deck has been around, but I mean, honestly, it looks kind of similar to the paper meta, besides Jund, Right, like John 12 copies, like John being 4% of the metagame, that's definitely an outlier. That is not true.
Yeah.
That deck is unplayable. It will continue being unplayable as long as people want to register Liliana of the Veil. If people want to be realistic and they want to play Lurrus, maybe we can have a little bit of a conversation, but just don't play Liliana Blood Red Elf anymore, please.
Yeah, I do think a lot of the versions were kind of the lower to the ground, like Lurrus, Monkey type ones, but there were a few old school Juns players as well.
Yeah.
Gabe, any thoughts on this meta?
Yeah, I think it's pretty similar to what I would expect. To echo what Evan said, I would have expected more Rhinos, or at least more Cascade in general. Living End was only at 2%, and I definitely would expect more of that. I think that deck is really, really good.
It's bonkers good.
I would actually place that as the best unfair deck in the format, or at least... maybe I should just say the most degenerate deck in the format, because I think it's a little more degenerate than Rhinos, even if it's a little easier to hate out.
Yeah, like I played against one of the citizens, and I were both at our LGS here in Denver last week, and he brought Living End, and he went easy 4-0. We actually got paired up against each other in the first round, of course, as one does when you go with a friend, right?
Of course.
And it's funny, like even when I had some hate out, my clock was not as, it's the old adage, if you have hate, you have to have a clock, right? Disruption without a clock is useless. And of course, like, he starts hard casting his creatures on 3 and 4 and 5 mana and things like that. It's just like, well, you have actual beaters that you didn't even need. You don't need the Living End type thing. It's just like this is a legitimate deck that has multiple angles of attack and super ridiculous redundancy. Like, Grief Ephemerate doesn't do much when they top deck Shardless Agent, know?
Yeah, and I think it's one of those things, with the Cascade decks, we actually talked about this in our latest episode, where Evan put this very, very eloquently. He was kind of like putting the Cascade decks in a sort of Venn diagram where you have, your setup required, and then you have your bustedness, and definitely Living End is a deck that requires a lot more setup, but in terms of bustedness, it's kind of like insane, right? Like completely destroying your board and then putting 20 power into play. That is what I would consider strong.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I feel like the setup is just cycling, right? And the setup is just drawing more cards.
Yes.
How bad is that?
You can use like hate to stop that setup. Like if your opponent is cycling, but you have like a relic going on, then you're kind of like
like a Void Walker.
Exactly. So that kind of stuff it doesn't really do anything in that sense. While the Rhinos requires no setup whatsoever. You just you just get 2 4/4s but that's it. You just get 8 power and that's all you get. Like you still have to deal with your opponent's side of the battlefield. Your opponent can just play 1 engineered explosive. It's just like, well, that's it. Like that's what it was. Like I just had those 2 Rhinos.
Right on. I want to talk more about this deck, or maybe a few of these decks later on this episode. But one of the things I was surprised to see not so much of is Amulet Titan. Only like 4 copies in the top 300. Food is basically non-existent. There was more Spirits pilots than there were Hardened Scales pilots. There were 3 Spirits, 2 Hardened Scales, right? It's just like the stuff that people were maybe sleeping on and not bringing as much. Like I thought we'd probably see more Grixis Lurrus. I thought we might see some more like Rakdos or Mardu Lurrus style decks as well. I think those are the kind of decks people seem to like playing.
Yeah, and the one thing that I would have thought as well is Reanimator. Where's Reanimator? I know it made the top 8, but I actually have been really liking just putting Archon of Cruelty into play. So maybe that's just like my soft spot.
Oh man, you and me both, my friend. That's what I've been trying to iterate on this week. It's a lot of fun. I think if you combine the Orzhov and Esper variants, there were 6 copies total, so that would kind of put it in the bottom of our chart.
Okay.
And those decks, I mean, they function fairly similarly, both some a little bit different angles of attack, I think. But so yeah, they're there, and like you said, as we keep going down into this metagame, we'll see them kind of, I think, keep floating to the top. So what I want to do is head into the top 128 of the meta. So it's kind of maybe like look at a conversion rate, maybe like a day 2. We're going to start seeing some, not the actual day 2. I actually don't know where the cutoff was. Maybe I should have. We start seeing some significant shifts from the wider overall metagame. So here we see Hammer Time shoot to 15.6% of the meta. So basically doubles its meta share from 8 to about 16. Murktide stays about the same at 9.3. 4-color Elementals also stays a little bit higher, goes up about 1.5% up to 7. Burn at 5.5. Rhinos at, this chart doesn't make sense. I'm looking at my numbers and they don't add up. But anyway, let's just go for total decks instead of percentages, okay? 5 copies of Burn, 5 copies of Teamer Rhinos. We've got 4 copies of Tron, 4 Living End, 4 Yawgmoth, 3 Prowess, 3 Unknown decks still. This is where we start seeing Reanimator. All 3 Orzhov Reanimator pilots made it to the top 128. 3 of the Heliod players made it up there. 3 of the Grixis Dress Down Shadow variants made it. E-Tron somehow sticking around. 3 of our Bring to Light pilots. So there was a total of, how many total earlier? I don't even have. I think it was maybe So 3 of the 8 converted. 3 Amulet Titan actually made it up to the top 128. So they did well. And 3 of the Affinity pilots also as well. So what I wanted to do here is kind of highlight who improved and who fell. And so most obviously was Hammer Time. When you go from 8 to 16, that's a big game when you're converting that well. I think Dress Down Shadow and Grixis Shadow in general did really well. Living End, as we were saying, a quality deck. Yawgmoth. And then our biggest falls were Jund. 12 pilots down to 2.
No kidding.
This one surprised me. And before we even move on to talk about anything else, Rakdos and Grixis Luris decks crashed. There was 11 of those pilots total in the top 300. None of them were in the top 128. What do you think? Was it just kind of randomness? Is this a deck that you think is being overplayed and overhyped right now? Like, is it just weak to certain things that people aren't prepared for?
I think it's a very rock solid deck that isn't
right.
I mean, it does have a little bit of vulnerability to graveyard hate, right? But besides that, it's kind of got that Jundiness to it where there's not too much you can do to directly hate this deck. It's not like it's Living End and you can just no graveyard, you're gone or whatever. I can't believe 0 decks made 128. It's just a very good deck. I mean, I've watched this deck do so much. It's a great Luris deck. I would say it's one of the best decks that are really putting Luris specifically to use, not just having an adjacent Luris.
I mean, what I think is that this is the kind of deck that you kind of give to your friend. This deck is just solid, but if you give it to a friend of yours that hasn't been played Modern for a while. I didn't want to be so explicit, but yes, if you give it to Shane and
he goes 1-3 drop because he doesn't know how to handle mid-range decks.
Exactly, but that's exactly what I was going to say. This is a deck of percentages. This is a deck of percentages where every single decision you make, and you have so many decisions to make, dude. DRC in particular. And I love watching Aspiring Spike as he goes through this. The amount of when he streams, he just every turn he's doing 7 things. Every single turn, it's just okay. So I'm gonna be playing this before this because of this reason, and then this gives me more value. So I'm just gonna bubble right now instead of bubbling on your upkeep because of this other reason. I want to play around this card, or I want to I need to draw exactly this card, so I need to do this. And I want to put, I'm gonna surveil this card of the DRC and put it into a graveyard, or I'm gonna keep it on top. There's so many decisions every single turn, and every single decision that you make it's just a possibility for a mistake. This is even though people I don't think they think about it in these terms, but these are what I would consider hard decks to play, because you have so many decisions, and the more decisions that you have to that's more of the possibility for you to make a mistake, and that's a percentage that you're losing. as opposed to decks that don't really have that many decisions, like Boggles or something like that. Like, you don't really have that many decisions. Once you have mulligan and you kept your hand, it's just like, well, turn one Boggle, because otherwise I'm going to mulligan. So like that it's kind of like more scripted in a way, or like at least harder to mess up. But in terms of like actions that you have to make every single turn, like the chances for mistakes are just astronomical. And, with every percentage that you lose, like your deck becomes worse and worse. Like Ragavan is just a 2-1, right? Like it's stoppable in a way. Sure, it's an extremely, extremely powerful card, but if you're not extracting every single little bit of value that you can from it and from DRC, then they become a lot weaker.
I think the opposite of this would be looking at a deck like Living End, because that's a deck where it's like, I'm literally just cycling my cards and then casting a thing. There's not really that many decision points. And then you see, like, it has a much better conversion rate because it's so much more straightforward to play.
Something interesting to note is that the versions with Shadow are the ones that made it. And I don't actually think these decks are all that different with or without Shadow. Like, yes, they're both, like you're going to have to play it differently in terms of like, okay, I'm going to shock this land even if I didn't need to. But either way, you're still playing those discard spells. You're still playing all these same like mid-rangey control cards. It's like they share a lot of the same things. And I'm curious as to, what that difference is. Maybe Shadow provides some of those free wins, and actually kind of disagree with you, Evan, of like, yeah, Living End provides free wins, but having played the deck some, I found it actually extremely challenging to navigate some of these matches of like, all right, like, am I supposed to go for it at this point? Like, how much am I supposed to cycle? Am I supposed to cycle this card or that card? Like, for instance, maybe you have to hold your black card because you want to, in case you drew Grief, you have to pitch it to Grief. So it's actually a lot more intricate than it might seem. And I actually think that's also very much the case with Hammer Time. I know there's a lot of kind of, it's just hammer time. You just put your hammer on the thing, hurt or I'm dead. And yes, they have those draws, but I actually think there are a ton of tiny edges with hammer time to be gained as well. Like, I know I played against Will Kruger in one of the like MTGO prelim things, and it was like I had played against Hammer the previous round, and all of a sudden when I played against him, it was like this is an entire different world. So they have those free wins though, so maybe that's part of that conversion rate. But then once you like do that cut, I think, those better players are going to rise. And I think a lot of the maybe worse ones will fall.
I have a theory about the Shadows Grixis Dress Down thing. And this is an extremely new archetype. And this archetype is almost exclusively being, brought forward by Spike, who actually top-aided the event with the deck. So
spoilers.
So what? Oh, I wasn't supposed to go there. All right, sorry. But anyways,
2-week-old tournament. Come on.
So what I'm talking, what I'm talking about is this requires a level of investment and being up to date that I would not expect from a casual player. So like if a player that registered Grixis Shadow with Dress Down, like that is a player that has been watching and following the format very carefully, exactly, and they did their homework, right? Like they're not just like showing up to play Magic and have some fun. Like those are players that are like practiced and that know what's up. So like I'm not surprised that they are converting in that ratio, and it was like 7 people total in the entire event. So like clearly it wasn't that many of them. So
right on. And then staying about the same between like the overall field and our top 128, Murktide, Rhinos, Elementals, Tron, Burn, Prowess, and Heliod all are still sticking out. They're not falling out. They're not rising above kind of their initial percentage share. They're doing just fine. And so we can head into the top 32 now, where we again are going to talk about some numbers. And then we can really see kind of top 32 is, I think, what we typically look at for what's succeeding. That's what we see on Magic Online when the big challenges and stuff like that. So we've got 5 copies of Hammer Time. That's about 16%. So that's sticking around 16. Murktide at 12.5. Rhinos about 9.4. And then we get our 2 copies each of Burn, Dress Down Shadow, Yawgmoth, Bring to Light Valky, and 4-color Elementals. Those are about 6%. And then a bunch of one-ofs like Is It Prowess, Tron, Polymorph combo, our Orzhov Reanimator pilot, our Panza pilot, even E-Tron. Blue Moon is hanging out there because why not? Someone who's good at Blue Moon. So what we can look at now is what our most successful decks over the day kind of look like. And I think the standout decks in terms of where they started and where they ended up were Hammer Time, Cascade Rhinos, Bring to Light, Valky, Yawgmoth, Burn, and Dress Down Shadow. And just a little bit better than expected were things like Murktide and Elementals. So what about these decks, y'all? Do you think it's the decks, the kind of pilots that would bring these decks? Because, Yawgmoth, I think there were 7 pilots total. So it's not like, that's not a huge amount of data for us to be like, okay, there were 20 Yawgmoth pilots and 12 of them made it type thing. So when you look at this list, is anything standing out as a surprise or what you kind of hope to see or plan to see?
Sure. I think the funniest thing to me is the Dress Down Shadow. Like you were saying, it has to be people doing their homework, and their homework is just watching Aspiring Spike. Like that's it. So, I think that's pretty much him propping up the category. I know we had a couple other pilots do that, but I feel like if Aspiring Spike wasn't at the tournament, maybe you wouldn't have so many Dress Down Shadow. It did such a good conversion rate.
Yeah, that's possible for sure. What I was thinking is these are just all top of the line decks. These are all decks that you could tell me could this deck win an event? Yes. If you told me Bant Ephemerate can win an event, I'm gonna be like,
What's this Bring to Light Valky deck doing? Because I pay attention to the game more than most people, I imagine. I still don't have a great grasp. Is that just kind of a Bring to Light control shell that has Valky as an option, or what is it trying to do?
It's more mid-rangey, but yeah, it's more of a mid-range deck. It's doing Omnath stuff. It's leveraging Omnath things. For me, it's very reminiscent of like pre-ban Uro. It's like what has taken place of that like 4-color Uro Omnath pile.
Yeah, I think that what we're talking about is the Scapeshift deck right here. That's at least the one that I saw on camera during the event. So. We actually played Spider and I played it in the showcase in the last showcase. It didn't go well for us, but it's a fine deck, I swear. So it's a good deck that can play Chalice if it needs to, and I think the Chalice is a very, very good card right now. Not so much as of the last week, maybe. But like a couple of weeks ago, I thought that Chalice was just really, really well positioned. So it's a very good deck that can play that. It has some early interaction in the form of Renan 6 and Prismatic Ending, so it can deal with smaller threats. And then it has a ramp with Explore and Dryad of the Elysian Grove, and then it has like sort of the mid game. That's when we start looking at Omnath, and then finally at the top end we have Bring to Light, which can find you either Valky, it can find your Supreme Verdict or something like that in case you're looking for interaction, or if you have enough lands in play, you can straight up find the Escape Shift and can kill you out of nowhere.
What I was wondering was actually, you just described the Escape Shift variant. I was wondering if this was actually something more like the Aspiring Spike deck of last season, which was the Luris Bring to Light deck that is more, blue-based. So you're playing like Archmage's Charm, and I don't know, maybe they're playing Counterspell now. I don't know how that deck has been updated, but because that was a really good deck in the old format, and that also played a bunch of the best cards. I know I myself was trying to iterate on that, and I think that shell can be built a lot of different ways, which is perhaps what we're speaking about right now is just, 5 mana Valky is still really good. It used to be 3 mana, now it's 5, still great.
Yeah. No, the one that I saw on camera at least was that one. So
yeah, the shells, the first 3 at least I'm looking at, all seem like they're the same build, where it's like the single copy of Scapeshift and like the Dryad and the Omnath and all that kind of just good value potential combo stuff.
Yeah, so those are the versions that are the most popular, and personally I think they are the better versions. So you have like random Dryad kills out of nowhere. You're playing the full 4 copies of Valakut, so you sometimes naturally find your Valakut, and then you play Dryad and you start using the fetch lands that you get from Renan 6, and boom, 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 just dealt to completely destroy your opponent's board, and you kill them on the following turn or something like that. But there are other versions, like when I was playing in the mocks, or like the mocks qualifier, I guess, I was actually trying out a version without that. And instead of doing that, you're just playing like a bunch of interaction. So you could play, you could add like a fifth color, play Kaya's Guile, Lightning Bolt, play some more early game and play more of a mid-range version, because I think Omnath is very, very powerful in that deck.
Oh my gosh, yeah, Omnath is absurd.
Omnath is extremely good, and the curve of, explore on turn like 2 or 3, or like or Drive or whatever, like ramp somehow, and then turn 4 play Omnath into a fetch land into Ring to Light it's just unbeatable. Like that curve is just absolutely ridiculous. So I because of that, I was trying to build like a deck that could play, multiple sweepers and like Kaya's Guile, which I thought was well positioned and stuff like that. So there's so much customization that's possible with this archetype, and it's a lot of fun. It's actually a very, very fun deck, because you are just doing your interactive stuff, and sometimes you have like this sort of races, and then Omnath comes down and it's just like, well, now the game is over, I guess. You start gaining 7 life every single turn with a fetch land or whatever, and it's a good deck. It's a good deck.
Yeah, just pull away with the game.
Yeah, I'm not surprised that the deck did well. But this one is, even though it's an objectively powerful deck, it feels more of a metagame deck in a way. Like it's just it's objectively good, but it's like better positioned against some decks than others, right? Like if there's a bunch of counter spells in the format, like namely Blue Red Murktide, who's also playing Blood Moon. It's not particularly easy to beat the Murktide deck with this archetype. Sure, like Super Verdict does a lot of work there, but it's hard to cast through a Blood Moon kind of deal. It's more of a metagame deck, I would say, than maybe the others, like the Hammer Time or the Rhinos deck.
Right on. All right, let's tie a bow on the Memorial Open. Let's go to the top 8. Give props to them. We've got first place Gary Wong on Teamer Rhinos, pretty stock-looking list to me. Second place, Christian Castro on 4-color Rhinos to complete our all-Rhino finals. I didn't see anything particularly interesting in either of these lists that stood out as kind of interesting tech, just solid decks piloted by solid players. Up next in third, Joseph Schelling on Jund Food. I like the look of this deck. I'm sure it doesn't play out would not play out well for me, because this is one of those kind of long, grindy decks. Jund Food is kind of what I think you would think. It's just like an Asmo deck. It's got the the Street Race and the Daredevils, but it tries to stay low to the ground with Dragon's Rage Channeler and Tarmogoyf to get the beats in. But besides that, the kind of typical Traverse, finale of Devastation, Bolts, Cookbooks, all that kind of good stuff. What do you all think? We didn't talk about food yet. I'm curious what your thoughts are on the food archetype and its relative fall from early success, more or less, or at least early high levels of people playing it.
Yeah, so I think food is kind of hitting, first of all, it's hitting a lot of the same hate that some of the other best decks are hitting in Hammer Time, right? So like if you have hate for Hammer Time Saga, you have hate for Food Saga, right? And it just so happens that one of the main cards in the deck, in Asmo, also gets hit by those engineered explosives, right? Or those you can get chaliced on 0 or something. I've been ratchet bombed. So I think it's been, it's hitting some of that splash hate. I also think that while this deck has some really excellent starts that, could be some of the best starts in the format, it's also not always that consistent. So I think something, this particular list, I'm looking at it and I'm like, where's the Ren in 6, right?
Yeah, right.
And I think that's kind of, at least in my mind, one of the missing pieces to this puzzle is you kind of need like a backup Daredevil, right? So you have like kind of these ways of, I like got the book off of Saga, or like I drew Asmo and I cycled Street Wraith, or I finale'd for it, but you don't actually have a way of like, if I didn't draw Daredevil, I can't like do the cool free thing every turn, which is like kind of how you, it's like what the deck is trying to do. And Ren and 6 can kind of function as that like additional, you just can like pitch that land you pick up every turn if you want to. And also, of course, Ren and 6 getting back Saga is insane. But the mana is really difficult. And I also think like some of these decks can be misbuilt. Not saying this one in particular, but Urza Saga doesn't really cast most of your spells a lot of the time, and it's just kind of like these decks are really hard to build. They can be hard to play. They also, trying to sideboard with them is really hard. And then while you're all trying to figure that stuff out, you're also getting smacked by all the hate in the format for everything else.
Right on.
I'm going to go ahead and say that, yeah, this deck is actually misbuilt and it should play at least 2 more lands.
That's so many decks, though, right?
Which is like
That's
something
so
that I say constantly. Man, it's crazy. It's insane how people constantly want to cut down on lands. I am exactly on the other end of the spectrum. I want to add more lands to my deck. I never
add some cycling lands, add some, horizon lands.
Dude, just add some lands that tap for mana. Like, casting your spells is great. Like,
I've heard that.
Not having to mulligan to 5 because you hit more, a bunch of one-landers, over and over and again. It's a lot easier to not hit one-landers when you're playing, 22 or 23 lands at least,
Right on.
But it's really, really funny. I see like Ren and 6 decks with like 20 lands and like 6 of them are fetch lands. And it's just like, dude, like what's Ren and 6 doing in this deck? You can never cast it. And like, even when you do, you can't even get back a fetch because you're only playing 6.
Yeah, to defend Joseph here a little bit, Traverse can look like another land here because it does get a basic land card for just a single green mana. But then you have to make sure you have enough green sources. And I'm not sure. Let's see. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, maybe shaving a little bit light on the green sources here to even be able to cast the Traverse. So there's a lot of issues that go into trying to balance a deck like this. And maybe you just shave a couple Traverse and you add a couple lands, and you're probably happier overall in the long run. But they did just fine. But don't be results oriented, right?
Yeah, for sure. And like the whole Street Wraith and Mishra's Babble count as lands arguments. Let's just don't. Let's not do
it's
that.
Not a real land.
let's be realistic here.
Up next, 4th place, Ed Bracamonte's Spider. Here's our Orzhov Reanimator friend with a pretty, I'd say, if you can think about a stock Orzhov Reanimator deck that's trying to do one thing, and that's reanimate stuff, it would be this deck. It doesn't have any Stoneforge stuff main. It's not doing any kind of weird alternate game plans. It has the Stoneforge package in the side with 4 Stoneforge, a Cauldron Complete, and a Batterskull, of course. But overall, this deck has one game plan, and it can be a pretty good one. But I've been playing this a pretty good amount, and I'm curious on your thoughts before I get into mine.
Oh, I hate this deck.
Coming in hot.
I like that they're trying to do their plan and they're like devoted to like, all right, this is what we're doing, right? I really, really dislike the Stoneforge package in the sideboard. This is like a huge package to put in your sideboard.
Oh my, yeah, I'm just gonna stop you there and agree. I just think it's like with the decks that this deck is bad against, you need so much more hate than what you can have with a 15-card sideboard where 6 of them are Stoneforge.
Yeah,
in my opinion,
it just doesn't. I don't think you can do that. I understand they're trying to do like a juke thing, so I would guess they're like boarding out their like Archons and the Emissary, like basically all the Reanimator stuff. But you literally can't do it. Like you've got Unmarked Grave as a 4 of, Archon as a 4 of. You've got your Priest, your Seraph. Like there's too many graveyard cards to actually board it all out if you're like expecting a rip or a leyline or whatever it might be. I also just don't love the whole like grief thing here. I know like when the format first came out.
We are speaking the same language. I want to go on, and then I'm going to jump in.
I know when the format first came out, everyone was, oh my goodness, like you grief and then you ephemerate it and it's just, woo, I win. And I just don't know how often that actually happens.
It doesn't happen.
It just doesn't. You
have
do
a 3/2 clock,
and then you have nothing, and you're not disrupting them after that. And then it's like your opponent just draws cards, like most cards,
and you draw like 2. You draw like an Archon of Cruelty, you draw like a redundant Persist, and you're not doing anything.
Yeah, you're doing actual nothing. And I get you can like persist the grief if they kill it, but guess what? They're empty-handed. So you're like, now you have a 2/1 instead, and you're like, all right, yeah, I'm really gonna get them with it. So I don't know. I think that while putting Archon of Cruelty into play is a super powerful thing. And I think like Sarah's Emissary can just straight up win.
Oh yeah, certain
matches.
matchups, just wins.
I don't like these just straight up like, here's the thing, do nothing else. Like, especially not with the Stoneforge package. I just wouldn't build the deck to be like an all-in Reanimator thing. I think if you're going to do that, the main deck here is close-ish, but I probably just like wouldn't do the whole grief thing. I just wouldn't do that.
I've actually been testing a build. I've just shaved grief entirely, and I've shaved Ephemerate entirely, and I've sort of added another Night's Whisper, a Bone Show, a couple things here and there, and brought Stoneforge main. Because it's just, that's my alternate game plan, is I'd rather have the alternate game plan of Stoneforge than I would of Grief. And I'm not saying this is right. It's just something I'm testing because I think that this deck they still have a long way to go in terms of how are we going to build this to be consistent at winning the game. Like, am I consistent at reanimating something? Maybe. Am I consistent at winning the game is very different. It's not always the case. Let's move on to our friend of both of our shows. I believe he was on Mishra's Babble pretty early, right? Everett Mohan, aka Aspiring Spike, on his Grixis Death Shadow build with Dress Down, and it's what you think it is. It's got good cards: Ragavan, DRC, Death Shadow, Kroxa, and the big tech. If you haven't been, we've talked about this deck a lot, and you might know what we're talking about, but you might not. And Dress Down was a card we all just kind of kicked to the curb during spoiler season. 1 in the blue enchantment with flash. When it ETBs, you draw a card. Oh, it sounds great. Oh, well, also creatures lose all abilities. Losing all abilities is something that you could just think about for the next half hour and think about the impact that could have on a turn, a block, an attack, anything. And also the fact that the next line of text, at the beginning of the end step, sacrifice, Dress Down. So that also, because it has flash, can come into play for a lot of different ways as well, whether it's you want it to happen on your turn, whether if you want it to happen on your opponent's turn. Like the span of time you want creatures to lose abilities, there's a lot of thinking and planning and manipulation of a game state that can happen with such a simple card. If you could call a card with 6 lines of text simple anymore. But so Everett identified, I think, primarily the interaction with Death Shadow, which Death Shadow reads, it gets -X, where X is your life total, 13/13. With Dress Down on the battlefield, Death Shadow is a 13/13. It's not losing any power and toughness because of your life total. That's pretty good. But then there's also things like Kroxa, with the ETB trigger, it doesn't have that, so it can just be cast as a 6/6 for red and a black. What else? What other kind of interactions have you all seen with Dress Down and game states?
This card does everything. So I want to give a little shout out to the legacy community, because that's where I was seeing it in action, and then was like, why aren't we doing this in Modern? And I feel like every time I see this card in action, I need to pull out a little notepad and be like, oh, it does that too. But the big things that it does in the format, particularly against Urza's Saga, it just kills the constructs. It's just blue and a 1, draw a card, kill all constructs. It also will kill Scourge of the Skyclaves, which is surprisingly nice if you happen to run into somebody still playing that card. You can do it in response to certain creatures. So for instance, if your opponent casts a Murktide, if you do this in response, it just won't have those counters on it. It's just going to be a 3/3. You can do it so that their Ragavan doesn't bounce. It doesn't have haste. You can do it so... basically, it's just endless. Every time there's a creature, think about playing this card. Oh, you're going to cast a Walking Ballista? Nah, it's going to be dead. Oh, you were going to cast a Pure Steel Paladin and try to do some cool sequencing? No, it's not going to actually equip anything this turn. And, you can even get this back in this deck with Luris at end steps. So that your opponent just oh, you're going to cast that Prime Time that I couldn't counter? Nah, I'll go ahead and heat it now. It does everything. No.
I feel like what makes this card really is the flash is just outstanding. It's absolutely outstanding because your opponent is forced to either, just decide that they want to play into it, or they can just just do their thing, and then you just completely blow them out. The big one is cards like Fury, Solitude, etc. They just do the stuff anymore. It's weird with those in particular because now they stick around. So because the evoke trigger doesn't actually happen, so you just get like a free 3/2 lifelink, but that's all it does. But so use responsibly. But those are definitely the big ones, because like your opponent is forced into doing the thing before they even know that you have the dress down, or like the interaction with lures. Like, I mean, we of course needed another card to make lures busted, so they gave us that on MH2 with dress down, and the interaction of being able to do it on your own end step, so it's going to be around for your opponent's entire turn, means that as far as you're concerned, like your opponent's never going to be able to just do anything cool with creatures on their main phase ever. So it's super, super powerful, and it's just going to keep getting better. Just like lures, it's only going to get better, and new interactions are going to be coming up constantly. And the card is the real deal. The card is definitely the real deal. And I'm not surprised that Spike was packing, just like the full 4 copies in the 75, 3 in the main deck, 1 in the sideboard. Like that is.
I'm curious if he would have wanted all 4 main. I didn't actually ask him, but.
You do have a lot of synergies, but you also kind of have like a couple of dis-synergies. Like, if you're forced into do it on your opponent's end step, like you're just blanking your lures for the turn, it makes DRC into a 1/1. So that's also something that you want to be watching out for. Of course, like you're the one in control of all of this.
That's what makes it good, right? Is like you said, it has flash, it goes away. There's like timing things you can do with it. You can make your DRC not attack. There's all kind of things that you might want to do with it.
One last note. This card actually removes protection. So, you're playing against that Hammer Time opponent, and you needed to kill the Karnstructs and stop the Pure Steel. You can now also bolt the Sanctifier in back. So it just is absolutely insane in that kind of matchup.
Yeah, I think you're right, Fran, which is like, I think we're sort of scratching the surface of this card. And it's the kind of thing that could go into other shells, potentially. Like, you might not get all the parts of the Buffalo like you're kind of getting in this deck, but I think there's a lot of ways that you can use this as this piece of disruption, a piece of tech, and there's a lot of fun to be had there as well, which is kind of why we play the game, right?
Yeah, no, exactly. This is probably after what is like 2 months since MH2 or whatever, maybe more at this point. This feels like it's the most interesting card in the entire set. Like, it just feels like it's the single card that it feels like we have kind of solved all of the other cards in the set, while this one is the one that's still surprising me. Just like, oh yeah, that's right. I didn't think the latest one that Everett had been doing was Thing in the Ice. So like you dress down, then you play your Thing in the Ice, comes into play with 0 counters, and now just one spell flips it immediately. So that was the latest one, and I'm just like,
is your upheaval
exactly? It's just like, that's another thing that it does. You just end step, your opponent's end step, you play the dress down on turn 2, you untap, you play your Thing in the Ice, and now on their turn you just bolt or like Thought Scour or whatever. Like they just bounce. They have to bounce everything. They can't even kill the Thing in the Ice unless they have double removal spell. It's insane. Like it's super crazy how like new interactions just keep on coming with a card like this. Also, like so many judge calls too.
Oh, I believe it. Yeah.
So many judge calls. It's a
like,
good time.
I forgot to take it off the battlefield, and I forgot that I did this, and should that have happened? All right. 6th place, we've got our mono white hammer pilot Colin Roundtree. The only thing weird about this deck is the singleton cranial plating, if you want to call that weird. Otherwise, it's a pretty normal build. I have to applaud their use of 22 lands. It's another one of those decks where people love to shave lands, and it's probably always a wrong decision. 7th place, Isaac. I don't know if it's Isaac or Isaac Contreras on Gruul Panza. This is what you think it's supposed to be, probably. It's got, it's running 3 Ragavans these days. I don't know if that's typical, but if you can play Ragavan, why not?
I just wanted to make like a little point about the hammer deck list, which is something that we are starting to see, and I think that we should start seeing more right now, which is the 2 copies of Hushbringer in the sideboard.
Oh yeah, it's essential.
That I think that is very, very important, just having some sort of like Hushbringer, Torpor Orb style card. The Elementals deck is very, very real. I don't think it's going anywhere, and I think that it's super, super strong. So like having access to
thanks for calling that out.
Yeah, and in particular, I actually do think that Hushbringer is better than Torpor Orb, particularly in Hammer, because Elementals has access to Force of Vigor, and they have almost the only way that they can answer a Hushbringer is like a couple of copies of like Prismatic Ending, or maybe like minus any with the Fairy or something like that. But they cannot answer the Hushbringer otherwise. So I think that it's even harder for them to answer the Hushbringer. So in the decks that I've been playing, I've been jamming some copies of Hushbringer in my sideboard, which we can talk about that later.
Right on. What are your all thoughts on Gruul Panza? Like, this is like the deck that has just continued to stick around for a year and a half now. It's just like, hey, I'm not a joke anymore.
I think this deck was actually good for a little bit in the MH2 format. And it's kind of like, there'll be moments where I'm like, ooh, I really want to play Panza this weekend. And then like the next day, I'm like, would definitely not play Panza right now. Having said that, I think this deck can just sort of do okay. I don't really feel like most of the main meta matchups are like good, but they're all like kind of winnable. And so it's like, well, like if you want to try to do kind of winnable and all of them, like I played this deck a while ago thinking I could prey on Elementals because I was like, ooh, Blood Moon. Blood Moon gets them really good. And then Elementals just demolished me. So, I mean, take that as you will.
Yeah, it's a weird deck in terms of, it has like a bunch of very, very interesting cards, but it feels like the second that those cards are not well set up, like the deck just goes from okay to like unplayable. So it's definitely very much a metagame call, I would say, with the exception that you can never ever beat a blue red Murktide deck. Like that's just unbeatable. So if you see a lot of like prowess and Murktide decks, like don't register Ponza. But if you
got to do your run of fouls. You just jam run afoul, you'll get rid of the Murktide. Don't even think about DRC being a 3/3. It won't happen. Just don't worry.
It will.
I do
it just won't happen. Don't worry about it.
The sideboard Torpor Orb in this deck also because of Elementals, and I think they actually skipped that. But Karn is still a powerful card, and if Fury is a powerful card, Renin 6 is a powerful card. It's not Ragavan 2, so you're doing at least semi-powerful things.
Right on. And then our last 8th place deck, Thomas Palm on Is It Prowess. It is what you think it is. Sticking around. I was surprised, not necessarily surprised. I mean, this deck still does things, but it definitely feels like it's just been sort of whole cloth replaced with the Murktide style decks, or, if you want to be an aggressive deck, you have a lot of other options these days. Something, even like Hammer Time, of course, has been shown to be super aggressive, or even Burn. But we see 7 different decks in our top 8. I'm pretty happy to see that. But overall in the tournament, what are your overall thoughts on this tournament? How is it maybe influencing how you're thinking about the format, how people playing at their LGS might make some decisions moving forward? I know that the Magic Online meta is just continually different than Paper, and the type of players that are there are different types of players frequently. So what does this make you think about?
I'm a little surprised. I expected, this is kind of jumping back a bit, but looking at the decks that are showing up here, being the first huge big Paper tournament in quite a while, I thought a lot of the like classics of the format would have been there, but this was really dominated by a lot of decks that are extremely dominated by new cards from Modern Horizons 2. Really expensive ones, and that really is much more of a factor in Paper, I found, than it is on Magic Online. On Magic Online, rental services, everybody's got everything, so as soon as there's like a new hot list, people are on it right away. This, to me, actually looked more like a Magic Online tournament than I would have thought, compared to like what your average, paper tournament would have been. I don't know if that's a result of there being this huge void of paper tournaments, and Magic Online has really been the only content available for this kind of stuff. I'm not really sure, but this is not really what I expected the field to look like. A big one was, for example, is Heliod. Like Fran was saying earlier, I thought that deck would have been really represented here.
Yeah.
Not only is it a deck that plays much better in paper, but it was something so many people were on before, paper tournaments really happening, and then it's just like not here at all.
Yeah, it doesn't really surprise me that what we're seeing, because we're only seeing the top performing decks, right? And what MH2 has done to the format, it has completely rendered a lot of decks entirely obsolete. It is very, very sad. It's really, really painful to have to hear it. But unfortunately, right now, like MH2 completely changed the face of the format in a way that it just completely brought the power level of the format up exponentially. So if you want to play Boggles, you are not going to win. Like straight up, you will not win. You will lose over and over and over again because you didn't get any good cards from MH2. And before, you used to prey on certain decks that would exist, but those decks that would exist have been pushed out of the format by MH2. And now, not only are you getting owned, but also the decks that you used to own are getting owned as well. So, Boggles, unplayable. Don't touch it, because you can, but you will lose. Like, you will not win a single match.
This guy hates Boggles, man.
No, dude, it's just like it's. I'm sad because it was the buy for Amulet. That's why I'm not playing Amulet anymore. Mm-hmm. Like all my good matchups have disappeared. Like I used to prey on all of these like silly decks, like gotcha decks, like Amulet, like a Boggles and Dredge, and those decks don't exist anymore because the new format, the new cards have said like, yeah, those decks cannot be okay anymore. Like you cannot win whenever you play those anymore.
Fran, I can't have asked for a cleaner and longer transition into our dive down segment. So let's head on out of here, take a quick break, and bounce on into the dive down. We're going to talk about thinking about Modern, playing Modern through the Modern Horizons 2 lens. So stay with us. All right, and we are back. And as both Fran and Evan were getting at, I think, before the break, Modern Horizons 2 has really changed Modern. I think it's pretty safe to say. And I know that you all have been talking about this constantly on your pod, as well as just the impact of Horizons 2 on the way that we're playing Modern, on the decks that are succeeding in Modern, the way we have to think about building and playing decks in this format. And I kind of thought about when I thought about the way Horizons 2 cards and card design impacted the format, what I really got to was kind of the efficiency, the flexibility, and the power of what we expect to be doing in Modern have all been increased, right? We've got, for efficiency at least, like Goldfish, MTV Goldfish, which has like the list of the like top played cards in the format, 6 of the top 50 cost 3 mana or more. And that's for the not counting the cards that can be evoked for free and whatnot and stuff like that. None of the forces. The numbers are similar for just creatures. They're similar for just spells. Not a lot of cards are even costing 3 mana or more. Like Modern has really been getting more efficient over the years, of course, right? But like Horizons 2 has really pushed this to a new level. Like your cards need to cost like nothing or nearly nothing, or do something very game-changing, even at the 3 mana spot. Like, I think before Horizons 2, I'd put that magic number of, like, this card better win me the game, or, like, turn the tides in such a favor that it's worth casting, like, at 4. Like, you could say something like an Urza, or maybe even a Cryptic Command, or, like, a Jace, or something like that. Like, that's 4 mana, right? And so
I like these cards.
But nowadays, I just feel like that pivot point that like this card better be doing something awesome is 3 mana. Like Seasoned Pyromancer is like refilling the hand, providing some tokens. Like the classic Kolaghan's Command is a built-in 2-for-1, and that now gets artifacts and stuff like that. Like, or it has to synergize with the rest of the deck, like Risen Reef or like Dryad. Those are our 3-drops that are doing something pretty broken if they stick around, right?
Yeah, I mean, for 3 mana, you get to completely wrath your opponent's board and bring a bunch of power back into play, right? And you can do that at instant speed whenever is the best time for you. So the bar has been brought up significantly, I should say. 3 mana giving you 10 power on turn 3 is very, very real.
I mean, what's wild though, Fran, is you could always do that. Right?
I mean, you could, but like now, as you were saying, like, so I think that one of the big things for decks like this, at least in particular, is the fact that now they don't have to jump through any sort of like hurdle, right? Because Childless Agent is just like, here it is, eat a silver platter, all for you to just win the game straight up. Before, like, these decks were playing Ardent Plea, right? Like, completely destroying their mana. They had to, like, stretch themselves so thin because, like, the only good, like, Cascade spells that are 3 mana are red-green, which is the one that we keep on playing, and blue-white. That's 4 colors. That's a lot of colors.
Yeah,
that's a lot of damage that you're taking from your fetch lands. That is a lot of hurdles and like a lot of jumps and hoops to jump through. And now it's just 3, and you can like cast dust of basics, and like your mana is super smooth. You get to play Blood Moon in the sideboard, right? Like that is what we're doing right now.
Yeah, I mean, and Living End also gets another hyper efficient thing in Grief, right? And Grief works really well in Living End, because it puts a card in your graveyard that you don't mind reanimating, and it's also helping clear the way for you. So that's just another instance of like, hey, we're not only getting redundancy, we're getting efficiency here too.
It's not just Grief, right? It's all the free spells. Shardless Agent just so happens to pitch to Endurance, Force of Vigor, and Force of Negation.
Weird.
Yeah, and we also have even more options, right? Like the Rhinos decks are now jamming Fury in it. Like these were the kind of decks that are just like, well, the price that you have to pay for this is you don't have early game interaction, right? Like Bone Crusher Giant is the best that you can do. And I was just like, well, how about I completely sweep your board of like, Ornithopter or like Memnite or whatever with this Fury that I just cast for free while holding out my interactive, like 2 mana to Brazen Boar where your next thing, like it's a lot. Like, and Modern Horizons 2 really gave way too many tools for not enough. It feels like if you actually look at the CMCs, it's not actually that low, but that's a lie. Like, Murktide is a 2 mana card. Murktide is a 2 mana 8/8 with flying that grows even further when you have multiples.
An interesting point to this, we're pointing to the Cascade decks as like an example of 3 mana spells that beat it. One of the other popular 3 mana spells in the format doesn't necessarily win the game, but it is like exactly the antithesis of these decks, the Teferi Time Raveler. So it's either things that are winning the game or things that are shutting down these very popular, these very big strategies right now.
Yeah, it's like really changed the game, right?
That card's been making a huge comeback, which is, I like seeing it. But
one quick point, the one card that actually secretly costs a lot of mana that's still seeing a ton of play is Luris, right? Like that's the secret one, because it actually costs 6, but
I know it's 3 twice. I mean, like for 1 mana, like here's the stuff that it's been added to the format. Like if I need to refresh your memory, like Ragavan, Esper Sentinel, Ignoble Hierarch, Dragon's Rage Channeler, Prismatic Ending, Unholy Heat, Underworld Cookbook. At 2 mana, we're getting like Murktide. Like you said, it's not really an 8 mana spell or whatever. Dauthi Voidwalker, Dress Down, Dam, Unmarked Grave, Sterling Grove, Sanctifier Anvek, Priest of Fellrights, and like, those elemental incarnations are all essentially free if you need them to be. That's just continuing the pattern that we saw with like the Forces from Horizons 1.
Yeah, and not only are all of these cards more efficient, which they are, but they are Unholy Hit is absolutely outrageous to me. Like, the fact that they printed Unholy Hit is outrageous.
I think that's the most egregious card in terms of impact on the format.
I cannot convince myself that Jace the Mind Sculptor is a reasonable card for me to play anymore, and it's hugely in part for that card. Like, Jace and Teferi have felt so bad to try to play as win conditions. Every time I slam, I'm like, I have 1 mana, it's gone. Even when you tick it up, it's so brutal.
Exactly, there's no escape, and there's certain cards that used to be like, they used to see play specifically because of this reason. They used to see play specifically because you're like, all right, like, I can play around Bolt with this one. Like, I can play my Dryad on turn 3, and I know that unless my opponent has a double spell, which is good for me, you know, playing against Burn or like playing against like a prowess deck. Like, if they spend 2 burn spells on my Dryad, I'm fine, because those are burn spells that are not going to my face. Well, now, out of here. Here's a 1
4
mana
was
spell.
that sweet spot.
Yeah, exactly.
4 was that sweet spot with toughnesses, even things like Wall of Omen and stuff like that. It was always like, all right, I don't have to worry about them 1-for-1ing with this thing. But
yeah, now I'm playing against blue-red, and it blows my mind that I resolve my Primeval Titan, and I have to set up the next one instead of haste attack, because if my opponent has Unholy Hit, I lose the game, straight up. Like, I just lose the game, because they kill my Titan for 1 mana, and then I have nothing left. So it's insane. Like, it's so unfair that I'm going through all of this work, man.
Right.
I'm working hard out here, you know.
Tell my Archon of Cruelty that too.
Exactly. Dude, like, we're just working so hard to get these big fatties into play, and then I only hit it for 1 mana. It's gone now. Jeez.
The other thing to add is the other premier removal spell from MH2 in Prismatic Ending, which says nothing is safe. You believed it was safe. Yeah. It isn't. Like, Fran's trying to play the Primeval Titan. He's like, turn 1 Amulet, and you end it. I try to play an Aether Vial. I'm just dead. Like, you're like, bye-bye Aether Vial. You're doing nothing.
Yeah, I think that gets us neatly into the next part of, like, the flexibility of these cards, right? Like, Prismatic End, like, you know, we mentioned Prismatic Ending, any non-land permanent, and it scales as well. So it's not like, hey, I'm hitting any non-land permanent, but it's a Vindicate. You know what I mean? Or like a Vindicate-like effect that costs me a couple mana. It just scales with what you need it to be. And Unholy Heat can be a perfectly good, like, what, Magma Spray type effect, or it's a ridiculous 6 damage if you have Delirium enabled. Like, you know, Dam's spot removal or a sweeper. Murktide Regent is flexible in its casting cost. It can be as expensive or as cheap as you want it to be. You can leave what you want in your graveyard to keep Delirium as close to enabled as you want it to be. Like, Ragavan can attack for 2 as a 1-drop, but also can provide you mana and card advantage options, and can be dashed to invalidate sorcery removal. So it's like we have the power and the flexibility and efficiency built into these type of cards.
Yeah. I've just accepted it.
You have to, right?
I was fighting it for the longest time. I was sitting there when the set kind of came out, especially as Murktide was getting popular. I was still just like doing my best to jam these very slow cryptic command based control decks, because right before Modern Horizons 2 came out, like, Esper Control was actually in a pretty sweet spot. That deck was actually kind of impressive, and I was just kind of getting into playing it again. And then the set came out, and I tried to keep playing it. Totally given up on that. I'm just all about monkeys and Murktides now. That's like all I'm trying to do. It's just a different ball game. These cards are just doing so much for so little.
Yeah, that's something that we also discussed. Is like the change in play patterns. Is, I think it's a big deal, right? Like, what Modern Horizons did is it completely changed the way that you play a deck for many years. Like, you get used to playing with a card for many years. Like what Evan was saying about, like, Jace plus. Yeah. Like, I play my Jace and I plus because I think my opponent has a Bolt. You know, like, that's a removal spell. You're kind of that's a play pattern that you're kind of like used to. You know, okay. Like, I'm trying to play around Bolt, so I play my Teferi Unraveler and I plus it because I want to make sure that I untap with it, and then on the following turn I'm going to be able to protect it and do all this stuff. Well, all of that, throw it in the garbage. it doesn't work anymore. All of that you thought that you knew about the format, it's gone. Now you're playing a control mirror, and you better minus that Teferi and get your card, because your opponent's going to untap Prismatic Ending, and you're not going to get your 2-for-1, and you're going to be super far behind. So you'd better adapt to the new play patterns, because otherwise you're just going to get completely stomped on.
It is different. It feels very different. Yeah, it's such an impactful set. So many of the cards are at the forefront of this format that it has a very radical change of, what you need to be thinking about while playing.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really good kind of strategic takeaway from this episode. And I want to keep picking your brains on this in terms of not only what's like strategies have been invalidated, but like what mindsets have been invalidated, do you think? Or like, how has your mindset had to shift in the way that you think about and approach the format in terms of maybe your deck selection or your deck building or just turn to turn?
I think the biggest thing for me right now in building any deck, if my deck is playing spot removal, which basically is any deck that isn't like strict combo, right? I want like at least 6 removal spells, because if my opponent plays a turn 1 Ragavan and I don't have one, I am dead, right? I just lose. And I think that's a really good point as to why you see 0 Aether Vial decks right now. 0. And it breaks my heart. I love Aether Vial. I would love to vial some things into play. And I just can't do it. Like, my opponent goes, like, let's say I'm on the draw. My opponent goes turn 1 Ragavan. I go turn 1 Aether Vial. Like, I'm dead. It's over. We're done. And what's worse is, even if I'm not against the Ragavan, I go turn 1 Vial, maybe I needed that Vial. You used to be able to Archmage Charm it to ferry it, and that like took at least a minute. Now you're just like, oh, turn 1 Prismatic Ending it. And I got nothing out of it, right? Like, at least if I play my Renin 6 and you immediately Prismatic Ending it, I pinged something, or I got a card. Like, everything needs to do something, or it's just like, I don't have anything to vial in at 0, right? I'm not putting Asmo in my Taxes deck yet.
I think that's true, but I don't know. I think Ragavan's an example people use a lot, but I think we weren't that far from that before all this anyways. If your prowess opponent plays a turn 1 Monastery Swiftspear and you don't have the removal spell for that, you're probably going to lose that game. Like, that was a big play pattern for that deck. Even Burn, they played Goblin Guide, and you did not immediately have a removal spell for Goblin Guide, and that Goblin Guide connects twice, maybe 3 times, but even just twice, you're probably actually losing that game. So while Ragavan is like the one right now, and it feels like the card advantage thing too, I think something about the feeling of Ragavan, like, yeah, it feels completely unwinnable. I think maybe more so than these other cards. I think those cards connecting, very similar result.
Just wanted to add, like, I do have a secret strategy right now of how to beat Ragavan, and I learned this from a legacy streamer, because Death and Taxes, Yorian, Death and Taxes specifically, has been doing really well there. And he was like, I don't care if Ragavan hits me, because all my cards suck. Like, I would love for them to cast this Thalia or hit that Plains, or, the Solitude that they can't cast. So that's my next strategy of, like, I got to put Taxes back in the format. It's like, all right, hit me. Take the Leonin Arbiter. See if I care.
Just play bad cards.
I think that there's a key difference with what you're saying, Evan. It's like the axis in which all of those cards that you're talking about would fight was life total. Right? Like, so that was the only axis in which you were getting attacked. Now you're not getting attacked. The thing that Ragavan does that it's so absurd is the fact that it doesn't only attack on the life total axis, and very, very importantly for the decks that play Ragavan specifically is the mana aspect. I don't think that you even care about the card advantage most of the time. Like, yeah, sure, like you sometimes get like a free like bolt or a free 7 visions, and it's incredibly backbreaking. But like that's not really what you're going for. What you're going for is, turn 1 Monkey, turn 2 DRC plus hold up counterspell. Like, that is a sequence that is not beatable. Like, there's nothing that you can do about this. If you didn't answer the Monkey on turn 1, like, there's nothing you can do about this. Like, your opponent is never going to draw a bad card anymore. it's because the DRC is just going to enable that. They're always going to be ahead of you on mana, and there's nothing that you can do to keep up, because if you were to be able to do anything, they would they just counter it. It's very easy.
I do agree that. I mean, that was kind of what I was saying, though, right? Was that losing to this monkey feels different because it is attacking on these other axes. My point was that while it feels a little bit different, those things surviving on turn one, the result was still the same. You lost the game, and they were kind of doing something even similar, where they were getting their Swift Spears down. I know we're not seeing prowess as much anymore. It's because this deck is kind of taking that spot, but they were getting these threats down, and while they weren't getting that mana advantage, I was losing to them spell piercing my removal spell all over the place. Like, they still did have the same play pattern of like play my thing, have a cheap interactive spell or protector, whether it was mutagenic growth to stop the bolt or a spell pierce to literally counter whatever the removal spell was. It was still very similar play patterns. So I just think Modern's actually been in a spot where we're losing to one drops like for a while. If you don't have the removal spell, you've always had to play the removal spell.
I agree with that, but to an extent, because if the only axis that getting attacked is your life, if you can maneuver into a point where you don't care about that life, then you can get away from that. What I mean by this is, like, your opponent does all of the stuff, like they attack your life, and then you play, if you're playing ad nauseam, or like you just play an unlife, and it's just like all the damage that you dealt up until this point doesn't matter whatsoever. If I have a double amulet draw, I play my Primeval Titan, you're actually just dead. So, like, sure, I'm at 1 life, I'm at 2 life, whatever. It doesn't matter because you're dead. So you can render that the damage if you maneuver in such a way. You can actually go over the top of that. You cannot really go over the top of the monkey. Like, I think that in my opinion is the big difference. Like, you can't really go over the top of the monkey because the monkey has a different surrounding, which is like the monkey allows you to play a control deck, because like the Builder Murktide deck is really a control deck. It's playing like counter spells, it's playing Archmage's Charm, and you're playing 18
Perhaps you mean
lands.
tempo deck, Fran.
Oh, let's not go there, please. No, but for real, like, it's one of those, like, these decks are playing 18 lands, and they get away with it because of Ragavan and DRC, because these cards just mean that they'll be fine. Right? Yep. It's the same thing that we see in Delver with, like, Ponders and Brainstorms, right? Like, it's kind of like the same concept of you have more business, so you have more spells, and you play less lands, and these cards give you either the mana in the case of Ragavan, so you don't really need to hit your land drop every time, or it gives you the card selection, card filtering, which is what DRC gives you. So, like, you can keep in one lander in your control deck and you're fine. Like, historically, if you were playing a control deck, you were playing 25 or 26 lands, because if you ever missed a land drop, if you missed land drop number 3, the game was over. That's just not the case anymore with these decks.
So we're focusing a lot on Ragavan, which I think is fair, is a very shifting and sort of power consolidating card in a lot of ways. Like, what do you think else? So we talked about Prismatic Ending. We've talked about Ragavan. We've talked about Dragon's Rage Channeler. And I don't know if DRC is not the kind of card that wins the game. Oh, hold on. I think it's maybe a little presumptuous to say she doesn't win the game by herself, because she does in a different way than I think Ragavan does. What do you think is actually happening to the format that is pushing out some of the older strategies that we knew and loved and respected if we didn't play them? Like, something like Atax's deck, Spider Space, or something like even classic Azorius Control, Evan. Like, what is happening to the format that makes those decks a lot harder to succeed with, apparently?
Well, so first of all, I need to use a term that I've coined that Evan hates, so I have to keep using it, which is the uwu-essence that we've been having. Meaning blue-white has been having a renaissance we've been seeing all these decks, specifically because of MTGO user Watu, or the Guillaume Wavatabo, just taking down event after event with blue-white. And somehow.
I've been playing those lists. It's not even... Those lists are good. Sorry, not to interrupt you, but I know that's been that's kind of been the sentiment around these, is like, oh my gosh, how are these people doing well with these decks? Because Nassif's been playing them as well. they're going against everything that I feel like we talk about this format and what we say is good in this format, and they're just like playing Factor Fiction, like this giant 4-mana draw spell, but they just kind of work. I've been playing them and just like rattling off 4/1s.
Hey, there you go.
Yeah, so like there is something to these strategies, and I don't quite understand why they're working, because on paper it doesn't seem like they should in these formats that are like low to the ground efficient. I don't know. It's very confusing. It's been something I'm trying to figure out.
That's kind of what I was wanting to get at, which is that the format is still adjusting. Like, yes, we have these top decks. Yes, they're still very good. But, you know, maybe that DRC or that Ragavan is worse in the format at large now than it was a little while ago, because everyone is doing exactly what I said. They were like, everyone has to have the 4 lightning bolt and, you know, whatever it is, your 6 removal spells. It's like all of a sudden, okay, maybe my Ragavan feels a lot worse now. And if my Ragavan feels a lot worse now, then, oh, maybe I get to untap with my turn 2 counterspell and Factor Fiction things, right? So it's like we're seeing these shifts of it got a lot mid-rangier, and all of a sudden Tron came out of the woodworks. And guess what? Tron was really terrible against that Ragavan, but if your opponent's trying to play blue-white control, maybe Tron's not such a bad choice, right?
Or elementals.
Yeah.
Burn's been coming out too, and I think that's a result of the Tron coming out now. Burn's kind of making a comeback as well. I've been running into a ton of that.
And there's like new versions of Burn that Spike is trying to, you know, sort of push and be like, hey, you need to be playing Ragavan and Dragon's Race Channeler and Burn, friends.
At least the DRC. I think that Dragon's Race Channeler is just so messed up.
Yeah, it's an interesting card.
It's insane.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and I feel like it wasn't really talked about as much at the beginning of the spoiler season.
Well, I think what's interesting is people freaked out because they were like, oh, I have a 3/3 flyer. And they weren't freaking out because they have something to spool through their deck with. And that's actually, I think, what's made it be far more successful than I anticipated. I called it probably the most overrated card in the set as a delver. It's perhaps the most underrated card in the set as a card filtering engine. Yeah,
and there's also, you know, another, which, you know, I feel like we when we did a set review, I feel like this is one of the cards that we brought up that nobody was talking about, that I'm like, I think this card is pretty busted. And the same thing we said about Prismatic Ending, which nobody was talking about Spoiler Caesar. Now, there's one card that we really did miss, and which is a really big reason of why DRC is so good, which is Unholy Heat. Unholy Heat is really, really good. And I feel like and I feel like that's one of the reasons why DRC wasn't really seen as good as it's going to be.
Yeah, the 1-2 combo.
Exactly. As an Unholy Heat enabler, DRC is incredible. Like, the consistency which you get, like, Delirium as early as turn 2 is disgusting. Like, it really is absurd.
I don't know if people were missing on Prismatic as much as Heat. Heat was definitely...
Yeah, Heat was slept on, I think.
Was super slept on in the beginning, for sure.
So... in terms of this pushes out some of even your favorite decks, you know, Fran, like Titan is a lot harder to play, I think, right now. I've heard you talk about that on Babble quite a bit, is that you're just kind of off it because you feel like you have to be. What opportunities do we have here? And I think, Evan, you've been hinting at it a little bit, which is like, there are ways to explore control decks. There are ways to explore, you know, the metagame on the whole. We've like you guys were mentioning, the sort of the evolution I think we saw even in Pioneer, which is like, hey, as the metagame gets mid-rangey, we get Niv going over the top, and then decks trying to go over the top on that, maybe with like a ramp, and then how do we get back under that? And like the cycle of the meta continues to flow. And in Modern, we have a ton more cards and a lot more power than we do in Pioneer. And so I think we can see the same thing happen in very different ways. So how are you thinking about approaching the format right now? Because, you know, as a streamer and as someone who's trying to, you know, keep their tickets flowing on Magic Online, you're trying to win. So how are you all thinking about trying to win right now?
It is really tricky. It's like you're saying, Modern is in this state where it is like constantly shifting. Like, it's not even week to week. It's like day to day that, you know, you're having to make pretty significant card choice decisions. I've been definitely finding it a bit challenging with Control specifically, because it's a deck that is so much a reactive strategy. So you see these very big decisions, meta decisions being made in the main decks and whatnot. Like Chalice main deck, a control deck that's running Chalice main deck is looking a lot way different than a deck that is not running Chalice main deck. You're having to make all these kind of decisions. It's hard. I am like, personally, I'm having to spend a lot of time consuming content when I am not streaming to try to keep a finger on the pulse of the format, because it is just, it's rapid changes rapid changes, and just trying to keep up with it, trying to keep with what people are playing. Like the other night, somebody was like, "Hey, just want to let you know, Burn's really popular right now." Sure enough, that night I hit Burn constantly throughout the league. It was like one league was like 3 Burn matchups, and it really is that fast,
Yeah, I feel like it's very important, at least for me. One thing that I've been trying to do is just I made a reputation as a streamer by streaming Amulet, right? And it has served me well. I'm not gonna say no. Like every single like competitive event that I've ever played in paper, also I've played Amulet, and I top 16 the GP where Oko was legal, and like I cashed the GP where Hogak was legal. A lot of this stuff with Amulet, because I was able to once you have a target that you want to hit, I feel like there's a lot of room to maneuver, and there's a lot of ways that you can have it planned, right? So I played in GP Hogak in Las Vegas, and I got paired against Hogak like 4 times, and I beat it 3 out of the 4 times, because my list was sick against Hogak. Like my list was tuned specifically to beat Hogak, and I had everything going on, and I was playing like Field of the Main deck when nobody else was playing it. I was cutting my Pact of Negation when everybody was like slamming Pact of Negation in the main deck. Like I was doing all of these tweaks and changes in order to fight the metagame that I expected. When I was playing, when Oko and Ursa were in the format, I built my entire deck, changed the mana base, added a bunch of blue sources so that I could play Mystical Disputes in the sideboard, and those disputes were great. So I did a lot of like twitching and like tuning and like making sure that I have a fighting chance. And then what happened with Valky, that the Valky winter, summer, whatever it was, like the T-Ball's trickery nonsense, or like the cascade into Valky thing. That's when I realized that sometimes it's better to just let go. So that is what has been helping me win a little bit more. When I was smashing my head against the wall too much, trying to, I wasted so many tickets trying to beat that stupid Valky deck, man. So many tickets down the drain, and just like smashing my head over and over again, like tuning this and trying this and playing like this card and trying this card out. Nothing worked, because just by design, my deck was, it just needed too many things to go right, while my opponents didn't. And there was nothing that I could do to slow them down. So it's just, I was in a situation where like from the deck design point, I was just losing 100% the battle. So when I moved on from there and I realized that, okay, I need to do something about it, is when I started winning more. I remember back in the Uro, like when I created the Green-White Reclaimer deck, that's what inspired it. I'm like, everybody's jamming 4 Aether Gusts. I cannot resolve Primeval Titan. It's just not gonna happen. Everybody's playing Aether Gust and Mystic Sanctuary. Okay, so what can we do? And somebody said as a meme, well, just vial in your Primeval Titan. And I'm just like, desperation can sometimes be helpful, and that's what I started doing. And I started playing with Reclaimer, and I'm like, yeah, Aether Gust sucks against the Green-White Reclaimer deck. It's just not very good. Like it's built to beat that card. So by learning when to like move on and try something new, that's when I've been able to find success lately. And this is what I'm doing right now with the Naya Lens deck that I've been working on, because there are a bunch of like nothing lines up well. Like Primeval Titan in Amulet just doesn't line up well against anything in the format currently. Like Tron, if you get paired against Tron, but you just have a bad matchup against Hammer, you have a bad matchup against the Murktide decks, you have a bad matchup against the Cascade decks. Like everything is an uphill battle. So what do? I just play a deck that can main deck Chalice of the Void, that can play Renin 6 and Prismatic Endings that kill Ragavans, and play Elvish Reclaimer that if my opponent doesn't answer on turn 1 is going to take over the game thanks to Urza Saga. Like that's just what you do. You know, once you accept defeat, and you can move on, and you can try to see, okay, how do I tackle this format? How can I attack this format? What are the key cards? Can I figure out a way to make these things work? And we're even seeing like the interaction that I was trying to work on was like Renin 6 plus Urza Saga. I thought that nobody was exploiting that interaction. And right now we're seeing exactly that with the Gruul decks that started showing up, which I think is very, very good. It's like a Gruul Ren Urza Saga deck. Like the interaction between Ren and Urza Saga has been busted from day one, and like nobody has been trying to break it out until now.
I think knowing when to give up is a big thing, and really like keeping your finger in the wind and admitting like, all right, there's nothing I can do. I'm a pretty stubborn Magic player sometimes, of like, I don't want to do it. I'm not going to give up on it. I can, it can be improved. It can be fixed. And, I had to make exactly that call. Like I gave up during Valky's Reign of Terror, and I believe I won the only big MTGO event with Valky because I was like, I embrace the degeneracy, right? And for what it's worth, I don't think we're at that spot where you just have to say, all right, always play rhinos or whatever it is. I don't think we're at that spot at all. But I do think we're at a spot where it's like, maybe you just can't register Merfolk. Like maybe you just can't do it anymore. And it's heartbreaking. But I haven't put a Thalia in my deck in a while because it hasn't felt good. And it feels like it doesn't matter even when the like meta is shifting, because you just still have such powerful things. Like it's really hard to mid-range when the best mid-range card is Urza Saga, and you're like, oh, I'm just not going to do that, right? I guess it's Urza Saga and it's Luris, right? And if you're just not doing those things, it's like, well, what are you doing? So what I try to do is I try to brew and try to like figure out good things at the moment. And sometimes I'm successful, sometimes I'm not. I know the last list that I was really enjoying was my like Grixis Reanimator / Indomitable Creativity deck. And I think that deck was really good, but I've also been losing with it the last 2 or 3 times I've played it. And the reason is because the format has already shifted from that moment of where I was beating up those aggro decks like Hammer and I was beating the other mid-range decks. It has shifted. So I played against Blue-White Control and they countered everything I did. So I put Thoughtseize in my deck, and then I played against Burn. and that's just how it goes sometimes. Sometimes you have to take that L and you go like, all right, now Tron's the big deck. So I just can't be doing my dirtily thing where I put Archon into play maybe, because my Tron opponent's going to go like turn 1 Relic, and then they're going to have Spatial Contortion or the Warping Whale to counter my Indomitable anyway, and their threats go over the top of what I'm doing. So you have to like, all right, like just like Fran said, the like Renin 6 deck with Urza Saga, I really enjoyed. Teamer with Urza and Renin 6 and Saga is probably the best, in my opinion, one of the best mid-range decks in the format for that moment. And now we're gone because I'm going to just play against Tron and I'm going to dirtle and lose.
Yeah, one of the things that I think you three have to do more than the normal player probably is learn from what's happening. Like learn from your games, learn from your matches. What do you think the best way our listeners can think about their matches and try to learn from them and adapt to the changing meta, right? Like it's a lot more than I won and that felt good and I lost and that felt bad, right? But it's sometimes hard for me especially just to get past that. Like I won, therefore it was good. What do you think people should be thinking about and looking at in their games?
I think the biggest thing in terms of keeping up is just consuming content, honestly. Like Evan just mentioned it, of like even when he's not playing, he's having to watch streams to know what's going on and keep your finger on the pulse. But as far as your own games, I think probably the biggest thing in my mind for players in general is being able to accept like, man, sometimes like this is what my deck is designed to do. Maybe I took a bad beat, or maybe it just like didn't line up. I know I was trying to play Living End for a minute and then just like drawing all the Living Ends in a match. And it's like, oh, this is like super low like in a probabilistic sense of like, it's just not going to happen, but it happened. And you have to be able to accept that. And like, that's the price of entry with what you're doing. And if you can get past that, it's not always an easy thing, but it enables you to like, okay, like I lost that. Why did I lose that? Was this out of my control? Yes. Okay. It's fine. Was it in my control? Well, okay. It's still fine, but what did I do that led to that point where I lost control?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say is I love losing in a way, because from the losses is where you can, I feel like you at least get the most. Sure, there's some losses that are, your opponent goes turn 1 Mem Knight, turn 2 like Cigar the Save, or like, and they just hammer you for 20 on turn 2. Like, sure, you had nothing you could have done there. Like, you kept a hand that had an ETB tap land that you were going to play on turn 1. The game is over, right? Like, there was nothing you could have done there. But I feel like the games that are close and I lose are my favorite ones, because those are the ones where I'm just like, wait, could I have done something different? Or like I did something and then I top deck this card that I didn't think of. I'm just like, oh wow, like if I had thought that I could top deck this card, last turn I could have done this instead, which would have led this to be the out. So now the next time that I find myself in a situation similar to this, I'm going to try to think, okay, what if I draw this card right here? So I feel like you can learn a lot from your mistakes in that way. And I feel like another thing is, or at least something that I do, like every Friday I do what I like to call a series called Know Thy Enemy, where I just play tier 1 decks, right? Like I just grab a deck and I play a tier 1 deck. And what I really love doing that, because by me being the person that's playing those decks that I usually don't play, it gives me an idea of what matters and what doesn't. And it gives me an idea of how do certain decks feel. For example, like this past weekend, I did Timor Rhinos. And that is a deck that for the longest time, I've been kind of like scratching my head and be like, why is this deck all the time putting up good results? Literally since day 1 of Modern Horizons 2. I remember like Timor Rhinos like winning the very first Modern Challenge or top 8 or whatever. I can't remember exactly, but it was towards the top of the tables and it looked busted. And I'm just like, how does this deck continue to do this thing? And I played it this past weekend and I'm just like, oh, this is why. The deck just has no fail rate. Like the deck never fails to do the thing that it's supposed to do. Like it just always does it on turn 3. So that's why you do it. Like most decks they need things to go right or they can't beat this kind of thing. I got paired against Burn, right? And my opponent goes like turn 1 Goblin Guy, turn 2 something, and I just put 4 force into play. I block their Goblin, and they're just like, they can never race me. They resolve an Eidolon, and I'm just killing them way before they're gonna be able to do anything. It's wild, and I'm just like, oh, I mean, this is wild. Like this deck just is super consistent. It does its thing super well. So by the end of the league, I'm like, are people just like actually skimming on lists? Like I always make this joke anyway, but like here it's just like I mulligan multiple 1-landers, right? Throughout the entire the couple leagues that I played, and I'm like, maybe should I just be playing one more land? Because like the deck doesn't do anything until you hit land of number 3. So I'm mulliganing to 5 because I'm shipping 1-landers left and right. Should I just be playing more lands? Is that actually the answer to the question? That's the way that I try to think about it. And of course, I do this way more with decks that I brew and with decks that I am working on. And this is what I did with the Naya Lands deck that I've been working on for like a couple of months now. Just like tuning and trying things out. Like, can I play Chalice in the main deck? Yes, well, turns out I can. Chalice is great. Awesome. But you figure this kind of stuff by seeing, okay, I lost against the Cascade decks like over and over again. Can I fix that with my deck? Well, actually, turns out I can. There is a way to fix it. So by trying things out in that way and learning from your losses, I feel like that is the best way that you can improve your game. And by saying your game, I include, of course, stuff like deck building or like metagaming and stuff like that. It feels like that's at least what has worked out for me and continues to work for me. So that's what I would recommend.
So kind of like Fran with Titan, I personally have built up Counterspell is in my deck. Is basically the thing with my stream. Like, if I'm playing something, then I want to play Counterspells in my deck. So I have with these control decks. What I'm really thinking when I'm playing is not so much play by play. It's usually like league to league. Am I approaching this format with the proper tools? Am I bringing the right things for the matchups that I'm seeing? And that was a big shift for me, because I know I initially approached this wrong. I was so excited about Counterspell coming out. I'm like, I'm gonna have all these Counterspells and Archmage's Charms and Cryptic Commands and all this stuff. And like now I'm like, all right, so I'm not gonna play Cryptic Commands. That was a mistake. I'm not gonna be playing these Jaces. I'm like figuring out it. League to league, it's always just exactly that. Am I playing the right tools? Do I have the right answers for what this, the questions that this format is asking? And that's the main thing I'm always trying to figure out. That's why I'm watching so much content. I'm seeing what people are playing. I'm seeing what kind of threats I need to be dealing with and all that kind of stuff. But that's a very specific to the archetype I'm often playing, more so than just like Magic or Modern in general.
Right on. All right, y'all. Of course, we are at time because we all have a lot to say. But before we get into wrapping the show up, I want to briefly give you the opportunity to promote yourselves. Where can people find you on Twitch? Where can they find Mishra's Babble?
Well, you can find me on Everos on Twitch as well as YouTube, and on Twitter as well, Everos TTV.
Yeah, I was going to say, I was going to be starting off with Babble, and Babble it's called Mishra's Babble, Babble, and the main places where you can find us are Spotify, Google Podcasts, Podcast Addict, Pocket Casts, and there are some other things. Hopefully, Apple Podcasts coming soon. I'm gonna try to look into that, and we're also looking into making like a Twitter account and stuff like that. Again, like since we started things with the podcast just for fun, like the whole concept was to just have some fun. We didn't really think all this stuff through, so
it spirals out of control quickly.
Yeah, exactly. We're like, well, wait a second. Do people actually care about what we're saying? Jeez, okay, I guess we have to take this maybe a little bit more seriously. Not too much more seriously. But yeah, so we'll make sure to eventually make a Twitter, and we're thinking about making a Patreon and stuff. But for me personally, I stream on Twitch at FPAWLUSZ. That is, it's pronounced Pavlush. That's my last name minus the EK. Don't worry about it. You just Google that Titan guy, and I may show up. And in Twitter and YouTube, where I upload all of my VODs, and in Patreon, you can find me at FPavlushMTG.
Finally, I am Spiderspace on Twitch and Spiderspace MTG on Twitter.
Easy stuff. Y'all, thanks so much for being on. It's been great to have some guest hosts to chat about Magic with, and I appreciate you all coming on. And everybody, go check out all these gentlemen streaming on Twitch. Go check out Mishra's Babble if you have not. It's a quality pod. And with that, wraps up this week's show. If you haven't yet, subscribe to the pod so you get the latest episodes as soon as they come out. And if you feel like it, go to Apple Podcasts, leave us a rating, leave us a review. If you want to get at us, leave us some feedback or a question, anything like that, you can find us on Twitter, The Dive Down, all one word, or email thedivedown@gmail.com. If you want to support us, keep us going, join our Patreon. Joining at any tier, even $1 a week, you get immediate access to the definitively discreet Dive Down Discord. It's the only place I like to hang out and actually talk about Magic, so head on over in there. Thanks again to Mana Traders sponsoring us. Sign up for Mana Traders using promo code TheDiveDown2021. Gets you 15% off your first 2 months of rental service. And as always, special thanks to the bands Nowhere and Space Blood for letting us use their music. And until next week, get out there and cast Mishra's Babble!